With our next lecture, we're going to look at the early history of Islam, beginning with its founding by Muhammad in the 7th century of the Common Era. So we return now to the center of the Middle East. We have here a modern map just to remind us of what it looks like. But we're going to focus on the Arabian Peninsula, the birthplace of Islam. So this map gives you a pretty good idea of the topography. Of course, we should ignore the modern borders, the borders of the modern nation states that are indicated here. And again, a reminder that back in the day, we wouldn't refer to this as Saudi Arabia, Saudi referring to the ruling dynasty today. So simply the Arabian Peninsula. And again, a reminder, as we discussed in our previous lecture, that very famously, the Middle East and Arabia in particular, quite an arid environment, a lot of desert. What we see here is a rather extreme form of that. The Arabian Desert, more specifically, a region known as the Empty Quarter, and indeed it is. This is in the southeast corner of modern-day Saudi Arabia, and it's quite vast. It's about the size of France, and really no one could live here. But not all of the Arabian Desert was quite that bleak, right? So, a lot of the desert you would find would be more like this, and humankind might scratch out some basic livelihood from this kind of environment. But the resources would be very limited, right? So it could only sustain a small number of inhabitants, meaning that these individuals also would have had to move around quite a bit, as in being nomadic. So the people we associate not just with the Arabian Desert, but pretty much across the Sahara, right up to the Atlantic, we're mostly nomadic pastoralists known as Bedouin. So we still have Bedouin today, but we should note that their numbers are steadily diminishing. A lot of modern nation states are very uncomfortable with having some of their subject population moving around from one location to another. It makes it very difficult to kind of manage them, control them, and certainly to tax them. But in any event, right, this was a very common lifestyle back in the day of Muhammad, particularly in the Arabian Desert. Some things we might discuss about what Bedouin tribes were like. First of all, generally they had very egalitarian social structures, right? So the idea is that essentially everyone in the tribe, and tribes, by the way, very often broken down into smaller units known as clans, everyone pretty much equal. There's no real political hierarchy or somebody who has authority the way we would associate with a king, for instance. Now, you very often did have older individuals who were highly respected, often referred to as sheikhs, the plural in Arabic, shayukh. And these individuals would have some measure of authority, but it was very informal, and mostly it basically had to do with the fact that they were highly respected. They might have demonstrated themselves to be very good warriors in the past or have leadership qualities. And so when they weighed in on any decision being made by the clan or tribe, it would have carried some weight. Now, loyalty to the tribe and clan was paramount. And, in a very competitive environment as you had in the Arabian Desert, this would have been really important. If somebody were harmed that belonged to your clan or tribe, you were obligated basically to avenge them. Ideally against the individual who had actually who had visited harm upon your fellow clansmen, but if you couldn't find that individual, it would be entirely legitimate to take out somebody belonging to that individual's clan. And as you might imagine, this could very easily lead to blood feuds, right? Because, then after you killed one of their guys, now they have an obligation to do the same against someone from your clan. And at some point, you can lose track, in terms of how the whole thing started. A couple of things I just want to say about that, right? Because, some people tend to exaggerate this as an aspect of modern-day Arab culture, which is, really, doesn't work that way today. And second of all, it's not entirely a unique thing to the Arab world if we're talking about, kind of historically going back centuries. For instance, you have, kind of similar mechanisms, for instance, in Italy with the vendetta. If you're talking about the Germanic tribes when they first started coming into Europe, you often had blood feuds as well. Even early American history, if you think about the history of Appalachia, very famously the Hatfields and the McCoys and so forth. So, not something entirely unique to the Arab world. And I say Arab world because we really are talking about the Arabs at this point, and this is pre-Islam. Now, if we're considering developments related to the early history of Islam as pertaining to Muhammad, we might consider some other aspects of what was going on at the time. So much of the Arab world at the time of Muhammad was sandwiched between two great empires that were very frequently at war with one another. The one here indicated in green, the Byzantine Empire, basically the inheritor of the Roman Empire. And so they were very often in conflict with an Iranian-based empire, the Sassanids, and very different empires. But the main point, as far as their impact on the Arab world, very often Arab tribes would be drawn into this conflict, very often as mercenaries on the one side or the other. In some cases, Arab tribes were actually being influenced religiously. So if you're talking about Arab tribes not too far from Byzantine territory, very often they had adopted the Christian faith. You even had some Jewish tribes, but the vast majority of Arabs were pagan at this time. Looking at each empire in a little bit more detail, the Sasanid Empire, the prominent religion there was Zoroastrianism, but it was kind of an elite religion, not something that the ruling elite tried to impose on their subject populations. And they were very tolerant of other religions. So you had, for instance, many Jews were residing in the Sasanid Empire, and also Christians who would have been considered heretics in the Byzantine Empire, rather than remaining behind and being forced to convert to the kind of more orthodox version of Christianity, what was accepted by the ruling elite, or being persecuted, they would flee to Sassanid territory. And that brings us to the Byzantine Empire, and basically the idea was that everyone should adhere to the state version of Christianity, what today we call Orthodox Christianity, and very intolerant of, certainly of anyone who was not Christian. So Jews would have been strongly persecuted in the Byzantine Empire, but probably even a greater concern about heretical Christians, right? Heretical meaning Christians that were deemed as having wrong belief. And such individuals were seen as a kind of a threat to the state because adherence to Christian orthodoxy was in effect a measure of one's loyalty to the state. So that gives us kind of an idea about the surroundings within which Muhammad would be operating. Finally, we should talk about his hometown of Mecca, which was, by the time of Muhammad, a pretty important community. So the vast majority of Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula Bedouin, but you did have a number of settlements, very often centered around oases where Bedouin had started to settle down. In the case of Mecca, by the time of Muhammad, had become very important both as a trading center. It was on the caravan route of trade coming up from the Indian Ocean, the Persian Gulf, making its way north to the Mediterranean. And so Mecca would have been along the way, and it became very wealthy in connection with the related trade. And perhaps more importantly, but something that worked in tandem with the trade, it became a center of pilgrimage in connection with a very important pagan shrine known as the Kaaba, right? And so those two things became very strongly intertwined. Kind of the idea that you came for worship, but you stuck around for the trade, right? They would even develop certain rules about how when you were in the vicinity of the Kaaba, you basically could not behave violently, which is really great in an environment where, you have blood feuds going on. When you showed up there, you had to check your sword at the gate, so to speak, right? And so therefore you could kind of relax and just simply engage in trade. And the inhabitants of Mecca became very wealthy in connection with this. And we might mention at this point, there was one tribe in particular that became extremely tied to Mecca, and that was the Quraysh tribe. And one clan in particular of the Quraysh tribe that became extremely wealthy and eventually became kind of the political elite in Mecca, known as the Umayyad. So it's into this environment that Muhammad will be born. Now, according to Islamic tradition, Muhammad was born in the year 570. And at this point, we might acknowledge that much of what I'm relating here is based on Islamic tradition, as in we don't really have any other primary sources that are not Islamic sources, that are completely somehow unrelated. For instance, maybe if there had been some kind of Byzantine trader who had been passing through and had written about his experience there. None of this is to say that that means that the sources are unreliable, but as a historian, we have to recognize that they're what we call interested sources, right? They ultimately are not simply about recording what happened for the sake of knowing, about past events. It is in connection with kind of the promotion of the Islamic faith, an interest to have a better understanding of Muhammad as its founder. Having said that, most historians feel that a lot of these sources are fairly reliable. Muhammad is never seen as a divine figure the way Jesus is in the Christian faith. And by the way, we have the same issue with regard to sources about the early life of Jesus. All of them are effectively Christian sources. With respect to Christianity, it's even a bit more problematic because, there they talk a lot about the divine nature of Jesus, the miracles he did, and so forth. In Islam, Muhammad is essentially a man, right? He's not perceived to be, somehow godlike. And a lot of the stories really do have a very human quality to them, which, by the way, also makes Muhammad infinitely relatable. Something I think that many Muslims for whom their faith is important, is something that they greatly appreciate. So in any event, right, I just wanted to provide some background regarding where we're getting this information. What we see here are two different depictions of Muhammad. One is basically depicting him via his name, written in a very beautiful calligraphy, and this is a very common way of representing Muhammad or God or pretty much anything related to Islam. The other is actually a depiction of Muhammad with the Kaaba, and you might be wondering why his face is veiled. There's kind of the idea that in Islam that you really shouldn't be depicting living things, that this is kind of an act of creation, and therefore it kind of can lead to idolatry. And so, there's kind of a discouragement, particularly depicting Muhammad, in his physical form, because that might encourage people to, instead of focusing their worship on God, kind of focusing more on worshiping Muhammad. And by the way, this kind of concern is very prominent in Judaism, where also there's kind of a discouragement of, images that might lead to idolatry. And both, Jews and Muslims, and some Christians, in fact, have taken issue with the, kind of the, very prolific depiction of Jesus, of the Virgin Mary, of various saints, right? The idea that it kind of pulls you away from worshiping God, and you might end up worshiping these individuals. Having said that, you do find, in fact, depictions of Muhammad and other important figures from the early history of Islam and living things in general, right? Even if in principle it was discouraged, periodically it does crop up. So we already mentioned the Quraysh tribe, to which the majority of the inhabitants of Mecca belong, that the dominant clan in Mecca was the Umayyad clan. They were the wealthiest and also constituted the political elite. This is very important for understanding later developments because these individuals greatly benefited from the pilgrimage, which was pagan, and the fact that it was tied to trade. And as you might imagine, they might not have been too excited to hear a message about, how there's only one true God and you need to abolish the worship of these various gods and goddesses that were honored at the shrine, the Kaaba shrine. So Muhammad, in fact, belonged to one of the weaker clans, the Hashim clan in Mecca. And of course, that could be a problem if he found himself in a kind of conflictual situation with the Umayyads. He was also orphaned early on, and so further weakening his status. But fortunately for him, he was taken in by his uncle Abu Talib, who, though also belonging to the Hashim clan, was a fairly powerful and influential individual in Mecca, which meant that if you made trouble for Muhammad, you would have to deal with him. And, if you went too far, for instance, and tried to kill Muhammad, maybe because you're unhappy with his message, you would probably end up in a blood feud, which, as you might imagine, in a settlement would be a much bigger problem than if you were out wandering around the vast desert. Finally, we should note Muhammad's first wife, Khadija, who was also, in a sense, his business partner. And through his marriage to her, he became a very successful tradesman. Now, this is kind of an important point. For the first 40 years of Muhammad's life, nothing unusual, right? No prophecies, no special divine mission, but by all accounts, a highly respected individual within Mecca. Someone had a reputation for being very fair, very just, very honest, but not doing anything that might be understood as making waves. All of that would change in the year 610 during the Arabic month of Ramadan, obviously a very important month, I think based on what we know about the 5 pillars. In that year, in that month, Muhammad received a visit from the angel Gabriel. So Muhammad had this habit by that point of periodically going out into the desert and meditating in a cave, right, where he could be kind of disconnected from all the hubbub of Mecca. And at some point, he was visited by the archangel Gabriel, which might be familiar to some of you if you are familiar with some of the angels from the Christian faith. Gabriel was the angel that came to Mary to tell her that she was going to give birth to Jesus. So he's kind of a messenger angel, and he still has that function here. And the message he has for Muhammad is that God has appointed him his messenger. And the message is pretty simple. The Arabs are to submit. And you might remember Islam is the verbal noun for to submit to the will of the one and only God, Allah. And so, by the way, Muhammad initially is very resistant. He's even wondering if he's lost his mind. He's going to consult with Khadija. She's going to consult with a cousin who had converted to Christianity, and he's going to be like, no, this sounds like the genuine article. And eventually he accepts that this is his mission. And, you can understand why he was reluctant. This is not a message that is going to be well received. It's very poorly received. And for a while, it's going to be tough going. The Umayyads in particular are not happy about this message, but initially they're like, well, it's really a shame what happened to Muhammad. It seems like he kind of lost it, but he doesn't seem like a real threat. And so they pretty much ignore him. And it really does take him a while to make converts. He does make a few early on, mostly of individuals who are close to him. But, slowly, he's going to have some success. Probably the two most important early converts are his best friend, Abu Bakr, and his cousin Ali, who is the son of Abu Talib, right? The guy who took him under his wing. But beyond that, it's really slow going at first. But eventually, the number of people who respond favorably to his message will increase, and at some point the Umayyad will become more concerned. So by way of summarizing at this point, the individuals that are featuring quite prominently during the very early stages of Islam that are part of this new Muslim community, of course we have Muhammad. Also important is Abu Talib, who, by the way, never converts to Islam, but he does make it clear that he will protect Muhammad if anyone makes trouble with him. Khadija, his first wife, who is also an incredibly important source of support, particularly morally. Ali, his cousin, the son of Abu Talib, who is an early convert. And then again, finally, Abu Bakr, his best friend, and who also converts fairly early on. Now, as I mentioned, at some point the Umayyads will become concerned about the fact that, this movement is beginning to gain traction. People are starting to convert, and this isn't something they can laugh off anymore. But so long as Abu Talib is still around, there really isn't too much they can do. They can't really threaten him. They do harass his followers wherever possible. Even at some point, some of them will take, according to Islamic tradition, will take refuge in Ethiopia, the Christian kingdom of Ethiopia, not Muhammad. Again, so long as Abu Talib is alive, he's pretty safe. But lo and behold, in 619, not only Abu Talib, but also his wife Khadija die. And this is a major blow to Muhammad. And also, it becomes clear very quickly that he is no longer safe in Mecca. Not just him, but the entire Muslim community. So the question is, they really need to take refuge somewhere, but where can they go? And then opportunity presents itself. Not too far from Mecca to the north, about 270 miles north, is another oasis town called Yathrib, today known as Medina, which is simply Arabic for city. Later on, it will simply be referred to as the city of the Prophet. But in Yathrib, so first of all, Yathrib is an agricultural community, very different from what you have in Mecca. And it's a younger community, right? So a lot of the tribes who are settled there had only settled recently, and they're starting to run into conflict. Particularly, there are 3 Jewish tribes that are proving to be a bit of a threat to some of the other tribes. And at some point, a delegation of individuals from Yathrib arrive in Mecca seeking an audience with Muhammad. So here's the thing we didn't mention. One way of resolving a blood feud is if all the parties involved agree to a third-party arbitrator. That can be one way to kind of settle it without bloodshed, right? So, we all agree to have a kind of neutral third-party individual come hear, everyone's side of the story, and then agree to abide by whatever decision he makes. And Muhammad does have a reputation of being this very wise and just individual. They've even heard stories that he might have some kind of prophetic ability and so forth. And so they go to him and they ask if he could settle, absolve the tensions between some of the tribes that exist in Yathrib. And Muhammad agrees on the condition that they allow him and his followers to take refuge there. And they agree. And this will lead to probably the most seminal event in the history of Islam, what in fact marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. What's known as the Hijrah, or migration from Mecca to Medina by Muhammad and his followers. And this takes place on the Christian calendar in the year 622. And you might be asking yourself, right? So they this goes pretty smoothly. They all manage to make their way to Medina without too many, any mishaps. Kind of sneaking out while the Meccans aren't looking, so to speak. But why is this such a seminal event in the history of Islam that it would mark the beginning of the Islamic calendar? Pretty much because it marks the beginning of the Ummah. Right up until this point, the early Muslims in some ways still torn between 2 different points of loyalty. Right, on the one hand, when they convert to Islam, they are supposed to be loyal to their fellow Muslims, and any kind of tribal or clannish distinction should no longer matter. But so long as you were still residing in Mecca, right, there's still a tremendous pressure to abide by kind of the old system, right, that you, in a sense, should remain to your own clan or your own tribe and so forth. Basically, by migrating to Medina, you are basically severing ties with the old system, with your old clan, your old tribe, and so forth. So it's generally considered as marking the beginning of the community of believers, otherwise known as the Ummah, right? Kind of, in a sense, Muslims are now a supra-tribe. This is your tribe now. Now, in actual fact, tribal and clan connections will continue to matter well up until the 20th century. But in theory, this is supposed to be how it works. In any event, the Ummah, the early Muslim community of believers, is now situated in Medina, or Yathrib. Let's say Medina from this point forward, just to avoid confusion. Well, initially a lot of the Medinas are not overly impressed with the Muslims, the Meccans who just arrived. I mean, first of all, this is an agricultural settlement. Many of them are coming, or most of them coming from a merchant background, wouldn't know a hoe from a plow, so it's not clear what they really have to offer Medina. But over time, fairly rapidly actually, but some Medinas begin to heed Muhammad's message and convert to Islam. Often these early Muslim converts from Medina referred to as the Ansar, meaning helpers, and they will prove very supportive to Muhammad moving forward. Eventually, Muhammad is going to demonstrate real leadership qualities, particularly in one way, right? So he demonstrates political leadership qualities, but also from an early point, military leadership qualities. So what happens is at some point the Meccans are going to start threatening Medina because the Muslim community is located there. And Muhammad decides, that the best defense is a strong offense, in effect. He starts organizing raids on the caravans traveling from Mecca north to the Mediterranean, and he proves to be really effective at this. And we should note that in Bedouin tribal society, raids of this kind are not only acceptable, but if you execute them very well, it's something that other Arabs would greatly admire. And Muhammad shows that he's quite good at this, and eventually this is going to kind of elevate his stock, not only among the Medinas, but eventually his reputation in this regard is going to spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And, there's nothing that breeds success like success. You're going to get kind of a snowball effect where, larger and larger numbers of individuals are going to begin supporting Muhammad. Now, one particular problem in Medina that we should probably address from a pretty early point, because we hear a lot about it, particularly with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also individuals who are trying to discredit Islam on the internet, has to do with problems Muhammad ran into with the 3 Jewish tribes located in Medina. So a few things. First of all, these are Arab tribes that had converted to Judaism, and they are powerful tribes. This is not some kind of ghettoized, small Jewish minority that are being oppressed, right? I mean, they're playing tribal politics as powerfully as anyone. And what became pretty clear at some point is not only that they were not supporting Muhammad, and in fact rejected the idea that he was a prophet, largely because he wasn't Jewish, and he didn't show any particularly great knowledge regarding the Jewish Bible and so forth. But it became clear at some point that they were actually something of what you might call a fifth column, supporting the Meccans, and therefore posing a real threat to the early Muslim community. And so on a number of different occasions, Muhammad tried to deal with this. First so the first time this became an issue, one of the Jewish tribes was sent into exile. The second time it happened, another tribe was sent into exile. But then the third time, all of the male members of the tribe were killed, the women and children sold into slavery. A rather brutal outcome, no doubt, but this would have been pretty standard practice at the time. And in fact, Muhammad likely would have been under tremendous pressure by the third incident to demonstrate that he was willing to make the tough decisions required of a leader. So you have references to these incidences in the Quran. And so you find passages that would appear to speak very negatively of Jews, but they are really speaking specifically about the Jewish tribes in Medina, not about Jews writ large. And in fact, you have other passages that speak very positively, not only of Jews, but also of Christians, when they're speaking about them as an entire religious community, and also calling upon Muslims to be tolerant of them as fellow monotheists. So I might mention at this point as well that from an Islamic point of view, the Jewish and Christian Bibles are in fact considered to be divinely inspired, hence why many of the prophets and many of the stories that appear in the Jewish and Christian Bibles are also part of Islamic tradition. But there are some differences, of course, and that largely has to do with the fact that while Muslims consider the Jewish and Christian Bibles to be divinely inspired, it is considered that both were corrupted by humans. The chief corruption of the Jewish Bible being this idea that the Jews are a chosen people and that only Jews can be prophets, therefore. And the chief corruption of the Christian Bible, the idea that Jesus, who, by the way, is a very important prophet in Islam, that somehow he is God incarnate. So this is kind of what they reject. And in fact, in some ways, Islam understood as a corrective, right? The idea that Muhammad was sent with this message to kind of get monotheists back on track, that they had strayed. Hence why Muhammad is also considered to be what they call the seal of the prophet, the final prophet, right? This is the final message, the one true monotheism. In any event, Muhammad's stock rising across the Arabian Peninsula probably a defining turning point in this regard was when they defeated the Meccans during the Battle of Badr, even though they were greatly outnumbered. And in fact, tradition would develop that they had been aided by angels who were fighting on the side of Muhammad. Whether you choose to believe it or not is perhaps not really the point. The point is, it really did start to seem to a lot of Arabs that, maybe his message is true, somehow feels like God is fighting on his side. And over time, more and more of the Arab tribes across the Arabian Peninsula would come under the banner of Islam. So this often happened via tribal alliances, right? So, after Khadijah died, very famously, Muhammad would eventually have 12 wives, right? So it was pretty much permitted to have an unlimited number of wives in pre-Islamic tribal society on the Arabian Peninsula. Islam will eventually set the limit at 4. There was an exception made for Muhammad, but we should understand that many of these marriages reflected alliances being made between him and other tribal leaders that brought them under the banner of Islam. And eventually, having united the Arab tribes, the Meccans would surrender. Right, they would arrive at a major. There was a likelihood of a major battle in 628. Eventually, they agreed to a truce with the Treaty of Hudaybiyyah, and by the terms of the treaty, it was agreed the Muslims would be permitted to enter Mecca the following year to perform the Arab Hajj rites at the Kaaba, which would now become a shrine dedicated to the one true God, Allah. The treaty, in effect, signified that the Meccans had accepted the Muslims as equals. In actual fact, the following year, Muhammad enters Mecca and the Umayyad clan basically surrenders and submits to the new faith. All the various idols of the Kaaba at that point are destroyed, and henceforth the shrine will be dedicated to the worship of the one true God, Allah. And interestingly enough, very shortly after that, Muhammad will die, after giving a farewell speech on the plains of Mount Arafat outside of Mecca. But at this point, all of Arabia is now united under the banner of Islam. And by the way, when you see in junctures in the Quran about dealing with pagans in a very brutal manner, it really is referring to whoever was still a holdout on the Arabian Peninsula, right? That Arab pagans, that this was no longer acceptable. At some point, they simply had to submit. Later on, when with the spread of Islam, right, when the Muslims would encounter other religions, well, first of all, Christians and Jews were considered to be fellow monotheists, so there was kind of the idea that there should be no compulsion forcing them to convert. They would have to pay a special tax in order to enjoy the protection of Muslim governments. But for the most part, they would be left to their own devices to manage their own affairs, certainly anything pertaining to religion. What's really interesting is later on when they encountered other religions like Zoroastrianism, later on Hinduism when they conquered parts of India, Hinduism in particular, you would think that, well, this is clearly a pagan religion that would not be acceptable. But what would very often happen is they would just find a creative way to define, in this case, Hindus as somehow being monotheistic, as a way of basically allowing them to continue their faith. This was not just about tolerance, but also a kind of a practical consideration. If you just conquered a vast territory where the vast majority of people who live there, who greatly outnumber you, by the way, belong to a different religion, do you really want to try and impose your religion on them? That's probably not a very effective way to govern, certainly not an effective way to start a new government in that territory. So I just wanted to say a few things about that. Coming back to the death of Muhammad, the immediate concern at this point was who was going to lead the Muslim community now that he was gone. And so first of all, it was made clear from the start that whatever authority this individual would have would be strictly political, not religious. Muhammad is the final prophet. Though later on we're going to find that there was some ambiguity there, and that would be a factor in the eventual schism between Sunnism and Shiism, which will be our next lecture. In any event, after consultation, a consultation was held among the more elite members of this early Muslim community, it was decided that his successor, and the term here in Arabic is caliph, basically, well, that's the English version of it, would be his best friend and one of the earliest converts, Abu Bakr. And so he would become the first of the four, what are often known as rightly guided caliphs, or Khulafa Rashidin. So the first problem confronting Abu Bakr is that after Muhammad died, a fair number of the Arab tribes decided, well, that was great, had a good time, but I guess, the party's over. And some of them decided to leave Islam, which is basically to say they became apostates, right? That they renounced their faith. And so the question was what to do about it. And Abu Bakr realized that if he didn't show some strong leadership in this moment, this new Muslim community would very rapidly dissolve, most likely. So this led to the Ridda Wars, basically aimed at bringing apostate tribes back into the fold. Many of them were actually, he was able to bring back in through persuasion, some degree of bribery and so forth. But some he had to fight. But eventually he was able to reunite the Arab tribes. And he kind of realized that, a lot of them had gotten involved because of the raiding activity, the possibility of conquest, booty, and so forth, all of which was considered entirely legitimate within tribal society. So he figured he had to direct the combative energies of these Arab tribes somewhere new, basically north. And this is going to lead to the very rapid expansion of this new Islamic empire in a very short period of time. Now, Abu Bakr only lived for 2 more years. He would be succeeded by Umar ibn al-Khattab, and so he's the second of the 4 Khulafa Rashidin. I like to think of him as kind of the Clint Eastwood of these rightly guided caliphs. Largely, he was a very fair and just individual, but definitely not someone to mess around with, kind of short-tempered and so forth. And so he would basically rule until he was assassinated in 644, and pretty much carrying out the good work done by Abu Bakr in terms of expanding the territory under Muslim control, kind of laying the foundations for what would become a vast Islamic empire. It was under his rule that Jerusalem was captured by the Muslims in 637. By the way, I should say a word about this idea of rightly guided. It doesn't mean that they were somehow perfect or flawless individuals. Really, it corresponded to the fact that they had known Muhammad personally. After them, successive rulers would not have actually known Muhammad in any kind of direct way. So, kind of related to this, the idea that they had a pretty good understanding of what Muhammad had intended for the Muslim community. And here we have a map that I think helps illustrate this early period of Muslim expansion, the territories that were being brought under Muslim control. And as you can see, this is already a lot of this territory coming at the expense of the Byzantine Empire and ultimately eradicating the Sasanid Empire. The Sasanid Empire actually falls very rapidly. And it was really interesting to consider. If you had asked anyone around the time Muhammad was born where the next great empire might come from, almost certainly no one would have said from the deserts of Arabia, right? So this would have really taken that part of the world by surprise. And they're also conquering territory very rapidly, so they're confronted from a very early point with how do you govern this new subject population. The number of actual Arabs/Muslims is relatively small. And by the way, contrary to popular belief today, stuff you often read on the internet, not only are they not forcing people to convert, they even discourage it. During this early period of expansion, there's kind of the idea that Islam is an Arab religion. It's a bit of a kind of elitist attitude. So they really don't want people converting to Islam. The question is, they also kind of see these subject populations, many of which are urban-based, as being kind of corrupting. There's the danger of the Arabs kind of losing their kind of Bedouin values and so forth. So you kind of want to keep them separate from the subject populations. So what they end up doing is establishing garrisons that will eventually lay the foundations for new towns. For instance, in present-day Iraq, Basra and Kufa, and Egypt, Fustat, which eventually will be absorbed by a city created later known as Cairo. You can see here on the right an image of an early mosque back from the days of Fustat. So today, effectively a neighborhood in Cairo. Basra is in the south of Iraq. We see it to the left, kind of a swampy area. But in any event, the idea, garrison is where you would have stationed the Arab soldiers, right, where you can kind of draw upon them if you have to put down a rebellion or something like that. For the most part, they're going to keep administrative structures in place in the territories they conquer. Administrators will maintain their positions and to a large extent governing by in whatever manner they had been governing back during the Byzantine period, or if we're talking about Iran during the Sasanid period. So a lot of this reflecting a kind of religious tolerance, but also a kind of practical consideration. How do you govern this vast territory that you very rapidly brought under your control? And again, contrary to popular belief, not only are they not forcibly converting non-Muslims to Islam, they're even, in a sense, discouraging this. Islam's seen as an Arab religion, and in fact, if you want to convert to Islam, and at some point some individuals do, for various reasons. I mean, they might feel, that they're drawn to the basic tenets of the faith. They might see this as the best pathway to becoming successful moving forward, in as much as the political elite at the very top of the pyramid are Muslim. But it's funny, early on, in order to do this, there's kind of the idea that you first need to become Arab. You need to be granted a kind of honorary Arab status as a client member of an Arab tribe. And then after you've kind of been accepted into the tribe, you kind of create this kind of fictitious kinship with that tribe. At that point, you might then be permitted to convert to Islam. So it's this Arab status as a client member of a tribe, the plural mawali, singular mawla. What becomes problematic is many of them, even after they convert to Islam, find that inasmuch as they're not really, air quotes here, really Arab, they're being treated as second-class Muslims. And this will become a bone of contention, in particular with Persians, right? Many of whom feel that they are a much more civilized people than these marauding Bedouin Arabs. I mean, they can claim to have a Iranian civilization going back with various Persian empires back to around 600 before the Common Era. But they certainly are not happy about the fact that even after they convert to Islam, they're very often being treated as if they are second-class Muslims. We now come to the third of the rightly guided caliphs, Uthman ibn Affan. And this is where we're going to start to see some significant divisions emerging within the early Muslim community. So Uthman, and this is kind of underpinning the reason why, was a member of the Umayyad clan. And you might remember that for most of the lifespan of Muhammad, they had been the enemies of the Muslim community, had been trying to destroy them, only converting at the very last minute in order, from the point of view of many early Muslims, to save their skin. Right now, in fairness, Uthman was not one of these individuals. He was a fairly early convert, all indications a genuine convert. The problem is that once he became caliph, he begins to kind of operate old school in the sense of, this feeling that you have a special obligation to your fellow clans members, or clansmen, let's be honest. And starts giving them the most important appointments, as kind of governors of newly conquered territories, important administrative positions. And this is going to be greatly resented by many of the earliest Muslims, including some of the Ansar, the early converts in Medina. And I think this is quite understandable, right? That they would resent that, certain individuals who had only converted at the very last minute are now getting high-level positions. The Umayyads, of course, make the case that they have a special talent for governing, given that they had governed Mecca before and so forth. But in any event, this is going to create a lot of tension. And then on top of that, Uthman is going to settle on a definitive version of the Quran, right? So the Quran, basically collecting the various prophecies Muhammad had received, And the thing is, like, very often they were not written down immediately. And the Arabs are very famous for having prodigious memories, famously being able to recite orally by memory, poems that if you wrote them down would go on for 150 pages. But nonetheless, there had ended up being slight variations between different versions of the Quran based on this fact. Nothing significant, right? I don't want to exaggerate it, but in any event, there was kind of a growing sensibility that we need to arrive at a definitive version of the Quran. Uthman made the call, and that is going to tick off many individuals who had hoped that maybe their favorite version of the Quran would make the cut. In any event, at some point, he was unpopular, with various elements within the Muslim community. Some of them came together and killed him in 656, basically while he was at home praying with the Quran open in front of him. By the way, the image we see here is a calligraphic depiction of his name that you would find today in the main mosque in Istanbul. What had actually been a converted church, but very a major tourist destination today. Well, that now brings us to the fourth caliph, and this is where things are going to start to really get dicey, right? I mean, there are certain divisions that had been kind of simmering that Uthman's manner of governing had kind of brought to the fore. So here's the issue with Ali ibn Abi Talib, right? Ibn meaning son of Abu Talib, right? So he is the cousin of Muhammad via his uncle Abu Talib, the son-in-law of Muhammad by virtue of having married Muhammad's daughter Fatima. Now, by the way, Muhammad had no surviving sons, so the closest thing he had to heirs, if you were somehow imagining that by virtue of being his son, they should succeed him, would have been his grandsons Hassan and Hussein via Ali. Now, by the way, I should note that from a pretty early point, Muslims heavily frowned upon the idea of dynastic succession, right? The idea that the leader should be succeeded by his son simply by virtue of the bloodline. But there were some Muslims in the early Muslim community who, after Muhammad died, felt that the successorship, the caliphate, should have gone to Ali. Basically, because of the bloodline. Now, over time, certain notions would evolve, that by virtue of the bloodline, he had almost quasi-mystical powers that gave him a perfect understanding of Islam, of the Quran, of what Muhammad had intended, and of God's will. I want to be clear, this is something that would evolve over time, but this did lay the foundations for what would become the split into Sunnism and Shiism. And so Ali was passed over, as we saw, in favor of Abu Bakr, but he will eventually become caliph, the fourth caliph, after the death of Uthman. But this will mark the beginning of a civil war known as fitna, or period of temptation, where Muslims were fighting Muslims, right? Where you would literally have a civil war within the Muslim community. Now, you might be asking why. I mean, he had just been, via the same consultative process that had seen the other three made caliph, was now the fourth caliph, so nothing really problematic there. Here's what was problematic. You might remember that under, kind of the old system, the tribal system, if somebody in your clan was killed, you had an obligation to avenge them. Well, Uthman was just killed, and his cousin, Muawiyah, who he had appointed governor of Syria, feels an obligation to avenge his death. And he basically indicates to Ali that he will not accept him as caliph until he turns over those responsible for Uthman's death. Right? So Muawiyah is now based in Damascus. Ali is in Mecca. The problem here is that those responsible for Uthman's death, many of them were among the most important supporters of Ali. And obviously, this would not be a auspicious beginning for the new leader to just turn over these individuals. It would probably be perceived as weakness. And in any event, things aren't supposed to be operating under the old tribal system. So Ali refuses. And eventually this is going to lead to a conflict between the armies of Ali and Muawiyah, culminating in the Battle of Siffin, which takes place over the months of May through July in 657. So it's really a series of skirmishes between their two armies. And for the most part, as it proceeds, it does appear that Ali is winning. And then Muawiyah does something very clever. Supposedly he was advised to do this, but in any event, he has his men stick pages of the Quran on the tips of their spears to appeal for a peaceful arbitration, basically kind of raising the white flag. Now, Ali's supporters, many of whom by this point really feel that it was God's will that he should have succeeded Muhammad immediately upon his death, they really don't feel that Ali should be negotiating over this, right? It's God's will that he be caliph, and he should operate accordingly. He's in fact winning, and so he should continue to prosecute the war. Now, in fairness to Ali, it probably was very painful for him to realize that under his leadership, Muslims were killing fellow Muslims, and so ultimately he agreed to arbitration. This would lead many of his followers to reject him, right? They felt that he was not basically abiding what God had intended for him, and so many would turn against him. They would become they would actually lay the foundation for one of the first sects, right? Kind of smaller religious group within Islam to emerge, known as the Kharajites, literally meaning those who go out, right? Who left the larger Muslim community. In the meantime, Muawiyah is going to be forging alliances with various Arab tribes. And over time, it becomes increasingly clear that Ali is perceived as being weak. Muawiyah proves to be very savvy with the kind of old tribal politics and eventually able to consolidate his authority over much of this new empire. As for Ali, he will have to contend primarily with the Kharajites, who will continue to harass him until finally he defeats them at the Nahrawan Canal in Iraq in 659 in a major battle. But unfortunately for Ali, shortly after that, he is murdered by a Kharajite seeking revenge for that defeat. And the Kharajites will kind of carry on for a while. We're not going to look at them too closely for now, but they kind of develop this very interesting principle that the leadership of the Muslim community should go to the best Muslim. And, it's not too hard to see why that might sound like a good idea. Like whoever is the best Muslim in the sense of, behaving the way a Muslim should, having knowledge of Islam and the Quran and so forth. Yeah, shouldn't that guy be the leader? But I think you're probably already imagining, well, the problem is who's going to decide who is the best Muslim? And that's going to lead to a lot of infighting. And probably for that reason, the Kharajites are never going to really get off the ground. As for Ali ibn Abi Talib, this is kind of the starting point for the schism between Sunnis and Shiites. Though a lot of the beliefs associated with that schism are really going to evolve over time. They're not established right at the beginning, at the point of Ali's death. Even if, as religious traditions are often presented as, being fully developed at that point, most historians would contend that, something that would evolve over time. Suffice it to say that for most Sunni Muslims, Ali is held in high regard, but he is simply the last of the four rightly guided caliphs, had no special powers or attributes, had never been designated by Muhammad or God or, any kind of divine power to be the successor to Muhammad. For Shiites, he is not only the guy who should have followed Muhammad, he is considered to have had certain quasi-mystical powers, as I already mentioned, which makes him the first imam. And we're going to learn more about what the imamate means in Shiism. By the way, the term imam is used by Sunnis, but it basically just means someone in the mosque who provides kind of instruction on Islam, not considered to have any special powers. In Shiism, the term imam designates not just Ali, but his heirs, individuals who are considered to constitute a kind of line of descent from Muhammad, by virtue of which they had certain quasi-mystical powers that made them the rightful leaders of the Ummah, the Muslim community of believers. Of course, none of them actually ever really have real power. Again, though, we're going to learn more about this with the third lecture when we look at Sunnism and Shiism in greater detail. In any event, that brings us to effectively the fifth caliph, not one of the rightly guided ones, but the guy who will basically lay the foundations for the first dynastic caliphate. Right? There are two dynastic caliphates, often referred to as the high caliphates. There is the Umayyad Caliphate, and then later the Abbasid one. But this is a good kind of finishing point for the first half of this lecture. Right? So this is going to be, just to make it clear, on a dynastic principle. The idea that when the caliph dies, he should be succeeded by his son, or at least the most capable or eldest male heir, right? It's basically kingship. And also to note that many Muslims are not going to be too happy about this. But then there's also the question of whether the Umayyad dynasty, if you will, proves to be effective rulers. So we'll finish with this map kind of indicating the extent of the Umayyad Empire at its high point. And the Umayyad Empire or Caliphate will carry on for about 100 years until 750. And again, many Muslims are going to become very unhappy, not only with this kind of dynastic principle, but also with the manner of their rule. Having said that, right, very often in Islamic tradition, the Umayyads are cast as villains. A lot of historians feel that this is not entirely fair. And so when we come back with the second part of our lecture, we'll try to give a balanced account. We'll start with the Umayyad Caliphate and then move on to the Abbasids.